meeting?
It's not so, the easy answer to that is not so much a matter of how many sources, it's more a matter of the quality of the sources and the extent to which you actually make use of them.
Gotcha, that's fine.
Now, you shouldn't use a single source as your.
I got three, but they're old books.
Yeah, but the important thing as far as that goes is that they come from different perspectives.
Yeah.
In other words, that you're examining debate, but in that case, I think it's reasonable.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin today's lecture, I just wanted to respond to a quick question that was asked by one of your colleagues, and that I think probably is of interest to most of you. And that was with regard to the research paper assignment that is coming due relatively soon. You still have a few weeks left to work on it. But I just wanted to very quickly reiterate some of the comments that I made earlier about the nature of the assignment and how it will be evaluated, in that that will certainly help you in crafting your research papers in as effective of a manner as possible. The easy way to explain that is that your grade, the grade for your research paper will be based 40% on the quality of your research, 40% on the quality of your analysis, and 20% on the quality of your presentation. Obviously, those are sort of rough figures, and there's considerable overlap between presentation and analysis, and to a certain extent between analysis and research. But roughly, that's what we're looking for, or how we evaluate the papers. And one crucial component in that regard, obviously, is your research. And one of the questions that came up is how many sources are we expecting on this research paper? And one way to answer that, or an easy way to answer that, is it's not quantity but quality that counts. It's not quantity but quality that counts. Now, in general, for a third-year research paper in political science, we would expect somewhere between 8 and 12 sources, but that depends very much on the topic that you're writing on. On some topics, obviously, they've been written on much more extensively, and there's much more in the way of resources available. In others, there's some topics that are pretty specific, and there aren't that many sources, and we will certainly take that into consideration. But one way of thinking about the research project is that really what we expect in a third-year research paper is a kind of a critical literature review. In other words, what we're looking for is for you to identify a topic that's relevant to the course. Most of you, I think, by this point have done so. To do some basic reading about that topic, enough to inform inform yourself in order to formulate a research question, and to formulate a hypothesis on that. Basically, your research paper in that context will be based on secondary research, meaning we don't expect you to look at government documents, we don't expect you to hold interviews with relevant individuals and so on and so forth. That's stuff that you can do in your MA theses and your PhD theses, but for the purposes of this class, all that is required is secondary research. In other words, look at the academic writings on that particular subject, familiarize yourself with the various perspectives that emerge from that, and essentially come to a conclusion as to which of those perspectives you find provides the most convincing answer to your research question. And then essentially present an argument in favor of that hypothesis that demonstrates the evidence in favor of your hypothesis, as well as offers some critiques as to why you find alternative views unconvincing. Now, to get back to the research component, basically, it is not a matter of quantity in terms of how many sources you have in your bibliography. If it were, it would be very easy to evaluate, and it wouldn't be very useful. Basically, it's really easy nowadays to come up with an enormously long bibliography. All you do is type in a word into your search engine and write down what pops up. That's relatively useless. And I would also say that's not a very good way of doing research. Basically, the best way to do research is not to use search engines in your computer that will come up with 10,000 sources or 20,000 sources, most of which will be complete crap. The best way to do research is to let professional researchers do your research for you. In other words, we'll start to a certain extent with the sources that I've already assigned in the course, and look at their bibliographies, and look at their footnotes, and insofar as you come across something that's relevant, follow that up, look up that source, and then go to their bibliography and their footnotes and so on and so forth. Basically, other academics in putting together their bibliographies have already done a lot of that homework, have already looked at all the useless stuff and sifted out what they think to be the best sources on that particular topic. So don't waste your time tracking down all sorts of other things that might pop up on a web search. Make use of the professional abilities of other academics. That's how other academics do research. And it's an important thing to keep in mind also in terms of writing your own research paper, is that your research paper should be modeled on academic writing. In other words, it should follow the same basic precepts. In that regard, one of the things that's often emphasized, and that I'm sure you've heard on numerous occasions, is the emphasis on plagiarism and how to avoid plagiarism and so on. And the emphasis that's usually put on that is that you will be penalized if you claim credit for somebody else's idea. And that's the important thing with regard to plagiarism. Yes, of course, you should give credit to people's ideas if you use them. That goes without saying. But to put an emphasis on that is really putting the emphasis entirely on the wrong aspect of what plagiarism is all about. Stephen Walt, who is a tenured prof at Harvard, is not going to be terribly upset because you didn't give him credit for his idea on your undergraduate research paper. In that sense, that's something that certainly if you were to write a book and plagiarize extensively his work and not give him credit for it, that's another matter. Then you might get sued, and there'd be good reasons for that. But the reason why we get upset about plagiarism, I would get upset about plagiarism in this university, is not because you didn't give credit to somebody that came up with an idea, but rather because research papers and academic writing are supposed to be tools to those that read them. In other words, they are supposed to be guides that lead you to better sources, to more information on the topic about which you're writing. And in that sense, when you come across an interesting point, something that surprises you, a good piece of academic writing will tell you where you can find out that information, where you can verify that information. If you don't provide the reference, then it fails to serve that function, and for that reason will be penalized. Furthermore, when I come across something that's very interesting, not only do I want to check whether that's accurate, but I might also want more information about it. And again, your footnote or your bibliography allows me to figure out where I can find more information about that and to find out about its accuracy. If you don't supply that, it doesn't function as as an academic piece of writing. And for that reason fails, not because you didn't give credit to somebody that deserves credit. So make sure in thinking about your writing that your piece of writing fulfills those basic requirements. That when you make use of a piece of information that the reader might find interesting, make sure that you indicate where you got that information from. When you quote somebody, make sure that you provide the information as to where you got that quote from. When you discuss something more generally, even when you're not quoting and so on, it's generally a good idea to indicate where the reader can find more information about this and so on. In that case, if you do all of those things, then your presentation and your research component of the assignment will get full credit. Again, one of the things to keep in mind in that regard, it's not the number of sources that you cite. I've graded thousands of undergraduate papers, and in many cases come across very long bibliographies with all sorts of things listed in them. And then when you read through the paper, you realize they only really make use of one of those things. And in that case, all of the other sources that are cited are basically kind of useless and don't add much to your grade. If you're not making use of the source in your paper, don't bother listing it. List the ones that you found useful, and don't bother listing the ones that aren't particularly useful. Now, the other thing is, of course, that if you're writing, if the assignment is a kind of a literature review, it is important that you don't ignore important contributions to that literature. So if, for example, you were writing on the U.S. relationship to the State of Israel, and you came up with all sorts of good sources, but you never mentioned Stephen Walt or John Mearsheimer that wrote the book on the Israel lobby that is sort of the core of the debate in American political science about that matter, well, that would be something that you'd certainly be, to some extent, penalized for. You need to try to capture all of the literature. And that's not as hard as you might think. Because, as I pointed out, the best way to start doing your research is to make use of other people's research. And when you come across an academic journal, in an academic or an academic article in a journal, one of the things that you'll find is that the first few paragraphs of that article will invariably start out saying, in this paper, I will analyze this particular problem. This particular problem has been approached in such and such a way, and in such and such a way. In other words, they have their own literature review in virtually every single article that you're going to come across. And that's basically what you want to model your own writing on. And therefore, if you've read a few of those articles on the subject that you've written about, it's very unlikely that you will not have come across a reference to somebody that is very important in having written on that particular topic. Does that sort of seem relatively straightforward and relatively clear? And hopefully not intimidate you even more in terms of the writing of your paper? Okay, in that case, let's leave that at that for the moment. And get back to where we left off last week. I was really hoping that we'd have a snow day today, but as I'm sure some of you were, but disappointing winter, what can we say? Last week, we began our discussion of Russian foreign policy, and we looked in particular at the rise of Russia as a prominent actor in international relations, its long history in emerging from the core of the region around Moscow, to occupying much of the Eurasian continent during the Soviet Union, at the height of the power of Russia under the Soviet system, from which it has drastically shrunk since that time, returning essentially to the borders that occupied it in the 17th century. We also noted that there were certain consistencies about Russian foreign policy, whether you looked at the Russian Empire, Russia under the Soviet Union, or the Russian Federation since that time. That these consistencies related very specifically to certain features of Russian society and Russian geography. First and foremost, the lack of clear borders has always resulted in regime after regime in Moscow trying to protect its heartland by essentially pushing its borders outward. And in that sense, invariably encountering more powerful states on its periphery, and suffering in that context from what might be described as security dilemmas. A second component is the lack of a clear national identity. That in part is a product of this outward expansion of territory that incorporated more and more distinct ethnicities, religious groups, and so on within Russia. A third is the relative economic backwardness that has plagued Russia throughout much of its history, with the possible exception of the period under Soviet leadership, when Russia did indeed become a pretty effective competitor internationally in economic terms. That's hard to maintain given the failure of the Soviet Union. But one of the things that I tried to emphasize is that the successes of the Soviet Union were well beyond what anyone had really expected of the Soviet Union when the Russian Revolution took place. What I want to do today is to finish off as quickly as possible our discussion of Russian foreign policy and turn our attention to the European Union as a political actor. And in that regard, I want to take a very brief look at Russian foreign policy since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when arguably Russian foreign policy has become much more unstable than it was previously. In other words, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the animosity that existed between the Soviet Union and Western powers very quickly gave way to a very positive relationship between the government of Russia and Western powers. In other words, the government of Boris Yeltsin that pushed aside the government of Mikhail Gorbachev, and with it the dominance of the Communist Party, looked to the West and to the United States and Western Europe in particular to help it transition to a capitalist economy to overcome the problems of the Soviet system. And indeed, the Western countries did, to a considerable extent, become involved in that transition by providing certain levels of credit, but most importantly by providing guidance in that overall transition process. That transition process of moving from a state-owned economy, in which there was no such thing as private property, at least not in productive resources like factories and so on and so forth, essentially meant a rapid privatization. And that rapid privatization brought into existence one of the most powerful actors within Russian society to this day, that is often referred to as the oligarchy. The oligarchy consists of those that benefited from the privatization drive. And for the most part, to make a somewhat long story relatively short, those that benefited from that privatization were individuals that were relatively well connected to the Russian state and to the Communist Party prior to that transition. They fell into two categories. Those that managed to get control over resources that were highly competitive on world markets, such as those responsible for the development of natural resources, especially energy resources in Russia, and associated industries, and those that inherited more of the manufacturing sector, which was far less competitive on world markets, and consequently far less interest in terms of providing enrichment for those oligarchs in question. It's in the context of this rapid privatization that large portions of the Russian economy simply disappeared. In essence, went into bankruptcy. It's that transition that also explains that the life expectancy of Russian citizens drastically declined in the period immediately after the collapse of the communist system, along with standards of living in Russia. And indeed, life expectancy is one of the best indicators of overall quality of life and standard of living, signifying a rather drastic decline in Russian quality of life, which threatened to undermine the stability of Russia by the end of the 1990s. And consequently required a reassertion of state authority that largely took place under the hand-picked successor of Boris Yeltsin, Vladimir Putin. The transition of power from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin also signified a drastic transition in the foreign policy of Russia, away from the view or from the aim of the Yeltsin government to integrate Russia as closely as possible into Western markets, into the global economy dominated by the United States, toward a more defensive posture, one arguably more anti-Western. There's two dominant reasons for that rather drastic transition in Russian foreign policy. One was the expansion of NATO eastward, that occurred under the Clinton administration in the United States, and at first incorporated Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, and so on into NATO, which was a violation of the verbal agreements that had been reached between Gorbachev and the President of the United States at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush, and the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, that had promised that insofar as Russia allowed Germany to be reunited within NATO, that NATO would not move 1 inch further eastward to threaten Russian interests. We talked about this briefly last class, and the reasons for that, which had more to do with the inability of the European Union to expand rapidly eastward than with a necessary turn in NATO toward trying to confront Russia or contain Russia. Indeed, in the discussions that led to the expansion of NATO, it was made explicit by the leaders of NATO that this was not a move against Russia, and that Russia would be given an observer status within the Council of NATO to reassure them that the expansion of NATO eastward was not a threat to Russian sovereignty. Nonetheless, from the Russian perspective, this was not altogether reassuring. From the Russian perspective, NATO should have disappeared when the Warsaw Pact disappeared. Should certainly have disappeared when the Soviet Union collapsed, because the only reason for NATO's existence was as a defensive alliance against the threat posed by the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union disappeared, presumably that threat disappeared with it. If the military alliance prevailed, it suggested rather strongly that Western countries continue to perceive Russia as a threat to their interests, something that they officially, of course, proclaimed was not the case. Suffice it to say that expansion did not result in an immediate break in the relations between the West and Russia, but what did was the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. In particular, the NATO intervention against Serbia in 1998 and 1999 in the struggle over the future of Kosovo. Serbia is populated by a Slavic population with close cultural ties to Russia, close cultural as well as religious ties to Russia. And it perceived the drive toward Kosovar independence as an attack on its sovereignty, and resisted it in large part because it claimed that the Kosovar majority within the district of Kosovo was a threat to the Serbian minority that also resided within that territory. Suffice it to say, and this is a thorn in the side of the relationship between Russia and the United States to this day, that the West supported Kosovar independence, and when the Serbian government in Belgrade refused to go along with that, supported the independence movement in Kosovo in their insurgency against Yugoslavia, and in order to prevent the Serbian government from taking more drastic measures to keep control over Kosovo, decided on a bombing campaign of Serbia to bring about Kosovar independence. This was first attempted through the United Nations, but in the United Nations, an international intervention on behalf of Kosovo was obviously vetoed by Russia. Consequently, it was under NATO auspices that the intervention took place. And that, for the first time, seriously undermined the relationship between the United States and Russia, and between the West more generally and Russia. The intervention in Kosovo was certainly supported by the United States, but arguably, as is argued in the chapter that I asked you to read on the European Union this week, it was the Europeans that were the driving force behind this, that perceived the instability in Yugoslavia as much more of a threat to their interests than the United States did. In any event, the pendulum of Russian Western relations swung seriously in the direction of growing hostility in 1999. And that hostility lasted for a fairly short period of time. Basically, by 2001, the pendulum swung back in the opposite direction, toward close cooperation. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. Anyone want to guess?
War on Terror?
The War on Terror, this attacks of September 11th. In essence, this was recognized by the government of Vladimir Putin as an opportunity to enhance cooperation between Russia and the West. In that, well, to put it in terms used in the reading today, the threat perceptions of Russia and the United States suddenly coincided. Both saw as a fundamental threat to their own security Islamic fundamentalism. Arguably, Russia had a longer experience with Islamic fundamentalism as a threat because of their long experience in Afghanistan, battling against the Mujahideen, the precursor to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And arguably also by virtue of the fact that one of the reasons why Zbigniew Brzezinski encouraged American support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to draw the Russians into Afghanistan was because he recognized that Afghanistan represented the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. In other words, that the populations in Afghanistan had very close cultural and religious ties to the Central Asian republics that were part of the Soviet Union. And that therefore any war on Islamic forces within Afghanistan would undermine the stability within the Soviet Union itself. And of course, that became evident in the collapse of the Soviet Union when these regions immediately withdrew from the Soviet Union and formed independent states. But it didn't stop there. One of the core regions of Russia that Russia was not willing to give independence to was the region of Chechnya, which is overwhelmingly also Islamic in orientation, and where the Soviet Union fought two wars against what they perceived as Islamic terrorists that were trying to gain the independence for Chechnya. In that regard, Putin immediately saw this as an opportunity to get the Western powers, and particularly the United States, on board in the suppression of Islamic fundamentalism in Chechnya, and to cooperate more closely in the war on terror more generally. Interestingly, in that context, one of the biggest problems that the United States faced in the aftermath of September 11th is that if they were going to go after the authors of that attack that were hiding out in Afghanistan, they had a big problem. Afghanistan has borders with Iran, Pakistan, and the former Russian republics, but it's otherwise landlocked. And that meant to gain access to Afghanistan, the American forces had to go through somewhere. Iran was basically out of the question, although Iran actually also recognized this as an opportunity to draw closer to the United States and to normalize relations with the United States, and actually offered substantial help in overthrowing their regional enemy, the Taliban. But the United States certainly wasn't going to get its forces into Afghanistan through Iran. They could do so through Pakistan. But Pakistan was somewhat problematic as well by virtue of the fact that especially the tribal regions that border Afghanistan are essentially hostile territory. The easiest way to get in and out of Afghanistan, therefore, with a great deal of equipment, was through Russian territory. And indeed, the Russians facilitated allowing Americans to access Afghani territory through their airspace and their territory more generally. In this regard, relations normalized to a considerable extent in the aftermath of the attacks of September 11th, but that more cooperative arrangement was also short-lived. It ended less than 2 years later. When? What happened? Bring a drastic transition about once again. When the United States decided to attack Iraq. Essentially, the Russians balked, rejected the authorization for that venture in the United Nations by using their veto, and consequently, once again, things became more hostile. That greater level of hostility has continued in that context for a number of other reasons. One is that under the Bush administration, the United States once again expanded NATO, but on this occasion included not just the remaining Eastern European countries, but also former Soviet republics, meaning the Baltic republics. And by doing so, essentially brought NATO right up to the border of Russia. And from the Russian perspective, as I'm sure you can at this point understand, having hostile military forces right on the border, on their western border with Europe, brought back rather bad memories of the Napoleonic invasions and of the invasion by Nazi Germany in the 20th century. In that regard, it certainly increased tensions. What increased tensions even further was the withdrawal of the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty under George W. Bush. Which was seen by Russia as a clear threat that the United States, A, viewed Russia, continued to view Russia as an adversary, not as a cooperative member of the international community, and B, that the United States was developing a first strike capacity in terms of their nuclear arsenal. Now, from the West, of course, we're not encouraged to think along these terms. We're encouraged to think that building a missile shield, and certainly George W. Bush indicated this, was not aimed at the Russians at all. It was aimed at rogue states like North Korea and Iran that were also developing nuclear weapons, supposedly, and missile technology. But from the Russian perspective, that wasn't very convincing. And one reason it wasn't very convincing is the placement of the missile installations that were part of that anti-ballistic missile system. Anyone know where they were stationed? The first installations were stationed in Czechoslovakia and Poland. And if the intention was to protect Europe from incoming missiles from Iran, why the heck would they be in Poland? The only possible justification for why they would be in Poland is that they're aimed at Russian missiles, aimed at Europe or at North America. He claimed that this therefore represented an attempt by the United States to gain a first strike capacity is not altogether difficult to understand. Basically, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was signed back in the 1960s on the understanding that any country that developed anti-ballistic missile technology would, by doing so, gain a first strike capacity, and indeed would gain a strong motivation to engage in a first strike. Because in the context of thousands of missiles in the arsenals of both sides, the idea that a missile shield could prevent a first strike from the other side, in which a country like the United States was attacked by thousands of missiles simultaneously, was virtually unthinkable. Each of these missiles back in the 1960s and 70s consisted of numerous warheads that would, once the missile was outside of the atmosphere of the Earth, split into several different warheads and hit different targets. And the idea that a technology could be developed that could track each of these incoming missiles and then the separate warheads and knock them reliably out of commission before they hit their targets was simply unthinkable. So why develop a missile shield at all? The basic idea was fairly straightforward. We might not be able to defend against a first strike by the Soviet Union, but we might be able to defend against a response from the Soviet Union once we've already wiped out most of their nuclear arsenal with a first strike. And that has always been the fear behind an anti-ballistic missile system. And that certainly was a fear that was rekindled by the abrogation of the ABM Treaty. In that regard, the United States and Russia again seem to be on increasingly difficult terrain. The situation since that time has obviously deteriorated rather seriously further, in part by virtue of the fact that the perceptions in Russia again deviated rather drastically from those in the West with regard to the various color revolutions that took place in Eastern European countries, in particular in Ukraine and in Georgia, that brought to power strongly pro-Western governments in those countries, and were perceived again by the Russian government as a kind of encircling of Russia, rekindling the kinds of paranoias that Russians have always had about an invasion from the West and a loss of their influence in the buffer countries like Ukraine in particular. That concern came to a head when the government that succeeded the government that came to power in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, that of Yanukovych, who was elected initially on the basis of bringing about a closer relationship between Ukraine and Europe, but was frustrated in that attempt by the lack of willingness on the part of the European Union to provide Ukraine with substantial aid to help it to pay off its debts to Russia, and to give it easy and quick access to European markets. At the same time that the European Union was rather reluctant to provide any real inducement to Ukraine to join or to become associated with the European Union, Russia offered a fairly substantial aid package to Ukraine, which the Yanukovych government signed onto, but a condition for which was that it does not sign a accession agreement with the European Union. That split Ukrainian society rather drastically down the middle. Again, Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union and part of the Russian Empire for several centuries previously. That meant that the eastern regions of Ukraine were almost entirely populated by Russian-speaking citizens. The western regions were predominantly Ukrainian and Ukrainian-speaking, and tended to look more to Europe. Now, Ukraine, as most of you know, has a pretty ugly history in regard to its relationship both with the West and with regard to the East. Russian treatment of Ukraine under the Russian Empire was enormously brutal. Essentially, the Russian government under the Tsar largely eliminated the intellectual classes in Ukraine and replaced them with reliable Russians that governed over the Ukrainian-speaking population, creating enormous resentment amongst the Ukrainian population, and creating one of the impeti for heavy collaboration on the part of Ukrainians with what they perceived to be their liberators from Russian oppression, meaning Nazi Germany. Ukrainians became very heavily involved in rounding up supporters of Russia and in collaborating with the aims of the Nazis, including in terms of rounding up communists and Jews and so on and so forth, and sending them to the concentration camps. In that regard, again, many of those that were subject to those forms of oppression by the Nazis viewed the Russians as liberators when they
liberated Ukraine from Nazi Germany. Others saw that as a reimposition of Russian control and Russian oppression. In that regard, Ukraine is a deeply split society. When the Yanukovych government was overthrown in 2014 by forces that were strongly backed by a group known as the Right Sector that had its background in the collaboration with the Nazis and used some of the same symbols. Russia feared essentially a strongly anti-Russian government taking control of Ukraine, which was a substantial threat to the Russian minorities in the Donbass region, and in particular to the predominantly Russian-speaking region of Crimea. 90% of the population of Crimea is of Russian origin. But what's also far more important in that regard is that when Russia granted independence, or rather when the Soviet Union granted independence to Ukraine, it did so on the basis of a deal that it would be able to maintain its only warm water port in the Black Sea in Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. In other words, Russia looked at the transition in Ukraine not so much as a domestic matter in the Ukraine, but rather through a geostrategic lens. In which NATO was taking away, or a country closely associated with ambitions to join NATO, was taking over its last port on the Black Sea, and therefore fundamentally undermining their interests. It's under those circumstances that, not too surprisingly, when the regional government in Crimea held a referendum for independence, that came out strongly in favor of rejoining Russia and becoming part of Russia, Vladimir Putin was only happy to accept that outcome and immediately recognized Crimea's return into the Russian Federation. Of course, in the West, we've seen that primarily through the lens of what is described as a Russian invasion. The Russians never technically invaded the territory. Their military was already there. There was no need for an invasion. And furthermore, 90% of the population of Crimea strongly supported the move to reincorporate Crimea into Russia. From the West's perspective, however, Ukraine was a recognized sovereign state and a member of the United Nations. And it had not acceded to the withdrawal of Crimea from its territory. And therefore, from their perspective, it looked like Russia had violated its sovereignty and readjusted the borders in clear violation of UN rules. Had in effect invaded Crimea, the Ukraine, and Crimea in particular. It's in response to that the Western powers imposed sanctions on Russia, and the relationship between Russia and the United States has only gone south from there. The withdrawal of the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty resulted in Vladimir Putin re-emphasizing military security in Russia, and consequently devoting a sizable portion of the Russian GDP to research and development into tools that would restore or allow Russia to retain a deterrent capacity to prevent any kind of Western aggression. In that regard, Russia certainly did ramp up its military spending. And its ramping up of its military spending and the expansion of its territory into the Crimea, in turn created some understandable worries in Western Europe that Russia had once again become revanchist, as the term goes, attempting to recreate its former glory under the Soviet Union, and that this was a fundamental threat to Western Europe. It is notable, however, and we'll talk about that in our discussion of the European Union, that the threat perceptions in Europe and in the United States differ somewhat drastically it is somewhat understandable that the perception of threat in Eastern European countries would view the growing military power and the willingness of the Russian government to restore its access to Crimea as an indication that they may have grander designs. And given that the countries on the periphery of Russia are relatively weak, especially the Baltic republics and including countries like Poland and Ukraine, and certainly are no military match for Russia, that they would be deeply fearful of a renewed expansion of Russia, and therefore have every motivation to try to get into NATO and to get a strong commitment from NATO to come to their defense if such a thing should happen. The rest of Europe, especially Germany, is in a slightly different situation. In essence, in particular Germany, but much of the rest of Western Europe, has begun to view Russia, at least in part through economic lenses, as a reliable supplier of energy, in particular of natural gas and to a lesser extent of oil. And furthermore, and this is again particularly the case for Germany, given the relative economic backwardness of Russia and its attempt to modernize its economy and its industries and so on, has an enormous potential customer for German exports. Germany is the biggest exporter on a per capita basis on the planet, and its primary exports are things like luxury vehicles and so on and so forth, which certainly the oligarchs in Russia have made ample use of. But secondary to their vehicles, which are the most obvious example of German exports, are industrial goods, machinery, and so on and so forth, for which Russia is a prominent market, or potential market. In that regard, there is a considerable split in Europe between the eastern countries that view Russia through a lens of military fear, and the western countries that are not that convinced that Russia is a substantial threat. Why are they not that convinced that Russia is a substantial threat? Well, certainly they're aware that Russia has a nuclear arsenal that is enormously threatening to the rest of the world if it were ever to be used. But they're also aware that Russia's defense expenditures are slightly less than the defense expenditures of Italy. In other words, that in conventional military terms, Russia is not really a threat to its neighbors. That doesn't, however, mean that Russia is a sitting duck. One of the things that has emerged in the last couple of years is that Russia has increasingly been reasserting its position in the international system in ways that are relatively creative. Certainly, the takeover of Crimea is a good example of that. But it was also a very good example of that, and one that some observers have argued demonstrates that the unipolar moment in world history is largely over, is the role that Russia played in the context of Syria. In Syria, Western powers essentially wanted to support a change of government in Syria in the context of the Arab Spring that overthrew a number of autocratic governments in the Middle East, starting with Tunisia, followed by Egypt. But each of those countries that underwent regime change were countries that were relatively closely aligned with the United States, such as Egypt and Tunisia. But the same movements that were backed in the case of Egypt and Tunisia by the Muslim Brotherhood, were also opposed to other authoritarian regimes, especially secular authoritarian regimes like that of Bashar al-Assad and Gaddafi in Libya. It's in that context that beginning with Saudi Arabia, governments in the Middle East began to support a movement to overthrow Bashir al-Assad, who in turn responded to initially protests with brutal force that seemed to throw fuel on the fire, and convinced Western powers to come to the aid of those attempting to overthrow the Syrian government as well, including Turkey. And including the United States. Therefore, at least 2 NATO members that became closely involved in supporting various groups attempting to overthrow Bashir al-Assad. It pretty much looked like Assad was history, with Barack Obama loudly proclaiming Bashir al-Assad must go, as did pretty much every other Western government, until the Russians intervened on behalf of Bashir al-Assad. And the Russians intervened for one obvious reason. They have, since the Cold War, had a relatively close alliance with Syria. The most important manifestation of which is a Russian naval base on the coast of the Mediterranean in Syria. The overthrow of the Bashir al-Assad government would almost certainly have meant that the lease for that base would not be renewed, and that Russia would therefore lose an important source of influence in the Middle East and the Mediterranean more generally. For that reason, Russia came to the defense of Syria. But I would argue it's probably not only for that reason. Basically, the intervention by Russia took the form of introducing Russian troops to help the Syrian national military to defeat its opponents. But it also took the form of a missile strike against a number of installations controlled by the opposition to Bashir al-Assad. And those missile strikes were fired off from a ship in the Caspian Sea. Why would the Russians fire off missiles from a ship in the Caspian Sea in order to hit targets in Syria when they've got soldiers there, when they've got a naval base right in Syria? The easy answer to that is that they wanted to demonstrate the capacities of their cruise missiles and so on, and to demonstrate that the West did not have a free hand in the Middle East. And that Russia, to a considerable extent, still had military capacities that made it a dangerous country to mess with. In 2018, Russia went a step further. In 2018, Vladimir Putin announced that Russia had developed a whole new class of intercontinental missiles that he described as hypersonic intercontinental missiles, capable of reaching speeds of 20 times the speed of sound. In other words, far, far faster than the intercontinental ballistic missiles that have dominated the calculations of war makers in the 20th century, and ones that would be impossible to defend against by a missile shield. In other words, Russia loudly announced that it once again had a deterrent capacity, and that we are once again in a situation of mutually assured destruction globally, and not in a unipolar moment any longer. To a large extent, that renewed ambition in Russia flowed out of Russian foreign policies makers that began to challenge the role of the oligarchs that had dominated Russian politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and most of whom were generally relatively favorably inclined toward a closer integration with Western countries, in part by virtue of the fact that many of these oligarchs, for reasons I explained last week, took substantial portions of their fortune out of Russia and deposited them in banks in London and New York and elsewhere as a kind of insurance policy against actions by Vladimir Putin who had demonstrated his willingness to go after some of the key oligarchs by recapturing control over the gas resources and oil resources of the Russian state that had been previously privatized. The group that I'm referring to is generally referred to as the Siloviki. Which is a word that translates roughly into where do I have that translated? Into Siloviki. Into where did I write that down? Forced concentration, basically. The Siloviki are essentially the group of bureaucrats in the Russian government, as well as in the Russian military, in large portions of the state bureaucracy, that see it as their goal to restore Russia to its former glory. And in that regard, while the oligarchs have, in terms of their cultural affinity, being relatively close to the Europeanizers, or the Westernizers as they're often referred to. Among the Siloviki, the worldview that has emerged to a far greater extent is one that is generally described as the Eurasianists. The Eurasianists that see Russia as having a fundamental role in bringing order to the Slavic parts of the Eurasian continent, and protecting the Eurasian continent to a considerable extent from the expansion of Western influence into it. It's interesting in that regard that Russia, largely out of necessity, has been pushed further and further out of the Western orbit, from which it to which it initially, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, wanted to integrate itself, and been pushed into a much more close relationship with China. And while some might think that that is a natural alliance, it is by no means a natural alliance. First of all, Russia is no longer socialist in orientation by any stretch of the imagination. Under under Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is better described as a sort of right-wing nationalist than as a communist. And in that sense, the communist system in China looks like a challenge to Russia rather than something that they would naturally ally themselves with. Furthermore, Russia and China have had various disputes over territory in the far east throughout their history. So in that sense, they are not necessarily natural allies. But the growing hostility, or the growing perceived hostility on the part of Russia from the West has also opened its eyes to the complementarity, if not a symbiosis, of Russia and Chinese economies. In other words, that Russia, above all else, needs access to consumer goods for its population, to technology that it lacks, and in both contexts, China recommends itself as a good trading partner. China, above all else, needs energy resources in order to continue to drive its industrial transformation and to fuel the enormous economy that has developed within China. In that sense, the two countries are very much harmonious. As Zbigniew Brzezinski put it in his book, The Grand Chessboard, in which he argues essentially for Mackinder's understanding of geopolitics. The most important thing for Western countries, for the Western Hemisphere, for the United States, in terms of its geopolitical interests, is above all else to prevent a unification under a single power of the Eurasian continent. And in that sense, what he counseled was that above all else, what the United States and its Western allies should do is to bring Russia into their orbit and prevent it from falling into the orbits, into a close relationship with China. But for various reasons, from the Western perspective, it's done exactly the opposite, and basically alienated Russia and more or less guaranteed that Russia has fallen into the arms of China. We'll see how all this develops as we move forward. But let me leave Russian foreign policy at that for the time being, as insufficient as that overall treatment of Russian foreign policy no doubt is, and move ahead to our next brief case study, which is of the European Union. Before I do so, let me see if there's any quick comments or questions or expressions of disagreement about the Russian case before we leave that behind. And take a brief look for the remainder of our time today at the European Union. The European Union, as most of you are probably aware, is a project that has been long in the making, that emerged to a large extent from the disaster of the Second World War, the enormous destruction of virtually all of Europe, especially Germany, at the end of the Second World War. That made it a pretty easy argument that war should never be allowed to take place on the European continent again. And in that regard, the European Union and its emergence reflects the dominance at the end of the Second World War of liberal perspectives with regard to political science, and to understanding geopolitics. Liberal perspectives that argued that the best means of overcoming conflict between states is to integrate them with each other in economic terms and in social and political terms as much as possible. And the first step in that regard is trade. Trade is the most basic form of cooperation between states, and a form of cooperation that invariably provides benefits to all that participate within trade arrangements by allowing those participants to specialize in those things that they produce very efficiently, and to not waste resources on producing goods that could be more cheaply imported and that would require greater resources to produce domestically. In that regard, liberals have long argued that free trade is the means of overcoming political conflict. The European Union, in that sense, took some important steps in the direction of political integration, or pardon me, economic integration, more or less from the beginnings of the end of the Cold War, pardon me, of the Second World War. The end of the Second World War, as most of you are probably aware, and as we'll look at in more detail when we look at German foreign policy, saw the United States, above all, interested in a rapid reconstruction of Western Europe in order to undermine the appeal of socialist and communist parties within Western Europe that might make it difficult for it to retain control over Western Europe in the context of the growing hostilities with the Soviet Union. The main means of achieving that rapid stabilization of Western Europe and rapid reconstruction was what became known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan saw the United States providing $14 billion, which in today's dollars would be roughly $500 billion, in credits to countries in Europe to help achieve their reconstruction. But interestingly, the Marshall Plan was offered to all European countries that had suffered in the Second World War, not just to Western European countries. However, it had certain conditions attached to it that the Americans were well aware that the Soviets would not abide by. And those conditions were essentially maintaining a free and open market, protection for private property, and so on and so forth. But they went a little bit beyond those minimal conditions to recommending certain basic economic structures that all of the Western European countries adopted in order to make use of or to get access to the Marshall Plan funds. And by doing so, Many historians have argued that the United States created the prerequisites for the closer integration of Western Europe through the institutions that eventually resulted in the European Union. The first of those was the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, which pooled the coal and steel industries among Germany, France, and 4 other Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Italy, into a single market. The basic idea of that was that coal and steel were the industries that drove the war machines of Germany during World War I and World War II, as well as the war machines of France and Great Britain. And that eliminating those industries as separate national industries would make it almost impossible for these countries to build up national military institutions on the basis of them and to make war against each other. Interestingly, Britain was not part of that arrangement, but it became the first step in a closer economic integration of Europe. By 1957, the European Economic Community was created. European Economic Community, which created a single market within Western Europe. Again, Britain was not part of this until far later. And while I don't want to take you through all of the various steps that were taken by the Europeans in order to achieve what eventually became by 2004 by the Maastricht Treaty, the European Union, things developed slowly from those beginning starts of creating a free market to eventually developing institutions for regulating that trade and eventually governing institutions like the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank and so on, to essentially create a European superstate. The intention of the European Union was always to create essentially a United States of Europe in a step-by-step manner, starting with the integration of certain industries, then spreading to the integration of the economies as a whole, then by creating governing institutions for all of Europe, in a process that is described in the context of Europe as the pooling of sovereignty. The pooling of sovereignty. The end goal of which is to create a sovereign Europe that speaks with a single voice, both within its own territory and in terms of foreign affairs, in the way that the United States does as well. Has the European Union gotten there? No. Will it get there? Very much an open question. But one thing that is absolutely clear is that the brains behind the project of the European Union always considered this project to be a one-way street. In other words, to be largely inevitable and desirable for all participants within Europe. There was never any thought that this process would be reversed in any way. And that was probably most evident with the introduction of the euro, which took place in 2003, and which replaced all of the national currencies with a single European currency, the euro. By that kind of time, of course, Britain was part of the overall equation, but just as they held out in previous cases, starting with the European Coal and Steel Community and so on, and been described throughout that process as the slow boat in the flotilla of Europe that is insisting on determining the speed for the rest of the flotilla. It likewise did not adopt the euro. And that is an enormously important decision on the part of Europe, of Britain, in large part because had Britain adopted the euro, the current process of Brexit would be way more complicated than it currently is. The fact that Britain still has its own currency actually makes it somewhat feasible. The idea of countries that have adopted the euro breaking away from it, like Greece, becomes much more problematic. Because all of their debt is denominated in euros, and consequently, how would they ever pay back those debts in separate currencies and so on? We won't go down that road. That's enormously complicated. Suffice it to say that when the euro was adopted, there were no provisions made for how that process could ever be reversed. And that is precisely the reason why the countries that within the European Union are known as the pigs. And that's not supposed to be a derogatory term. It refers to Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, not to the animals that are also known by that name. Got themselves into trouble essentially because within that single market and with a single currency, they were finding that their consumers were buying enormous amounts of goods from Germany and Great Britain and France, in particular from Germany. But Germans weren't coming to spend as much money in Spain and Portugal and Italy and Greece to even out that overall picture. In other words, these countries were consistently developing more and more debts that they had to finance through the European Central Bank in order to make ends meet. Under normal circumstances, when something like that occurs, the country in question that finds itself in too much debt devalues its currency. And by devaluing its currency, makes all imported goods more expensive on their domestic markets, and therefore reduces their imports, and makes their domestic market much more attractive to foreign investors, to foreign purchasers, to tourists, and so on and so forth, in a way so as to even that out. But once you're on the euro, you can't devalue any longer, and consequently, that road is shut. And all that you can do is keep borrowing to meet your needs, and to impose strict austerity on your domestic population in the hopes that you can recover those funds in order to meet your debt obligations. The European Union, in that sense, was always seen as a one-way street. However, in trying to understand the development of the European Union, the conventional wisdom in the period prior to 1991 was that the European Union was an experiment that could succeed for one unique reason. And that is that all of the countries that made up the European Union had become, by the end of the Second World War, relatively weak players in the international system. They've been long bypassed by the Soviet Union, and in particular the United States, in terms of their geopolitical capacities, even though they may still have remained important economically. And all of the countries of Western Europe shared, or the governments of the countries of Western Europe, I should say, shared the same threat perception. And that threat perception was that the main threat against European stability emanated from the Soviet Union and required that they put their differences aside in order to confront that joint threat to their security. In that regard, joining NATO was a relatively easy decision, and developing a unified economic system also seemed not to undermine any core cultural values and to be useful in confronting the Soviet Union. Now that basic picture would have suggested two things. First of all, that once the Soviet threat disappeared, NATO would disappear with it, and so would that common threat perception among Europeans. And that would suddenly allow them to discover that maybe they weren't on the same page on every issue in relationship to their trade partners in other parts of the world and their security fears and so on and so forth. In other words, that with the end of the Cold War, the project of European integration would come to an end. But as many of you know, the disintegration of the Soviet Union did not bring about the end of the European Union. In fact, it had almost the exact opposite effect. It reinvigorated the Soviet Union, and most of the most decisive steps in bringing about the Soviet Union were taken after, bringing about the European Union, were taken after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why? Well, I think your textbook, or the article that I asked you to read in your textbook, gives us a pretty good explanation of that. With the Soviet Union disappearing, the Europeans had a couple of different problems that they had to confront. One of which was that while they no longer completely agreed on what kinds of threats existed to the European heartland, they nonetheless were aware of their limited capacities militarily themselves in terms of providing their own security. And that made them, whether they liked it or not, reliant on a continuation of a security arrangement with the United States. But what was not at all clear was that the United States would have any interest in continuing to protect Europe. In other words, the threat perceptions of Europe and the United States departed to a significant extent. As long as they both feared the Soviet Union pushed the European Union and the United States together. With the absence of the European Union, it was entirely possible that the Americans would simply allow the Europeans to deal with their problems themselves. And that issue came up to a considerable extent in the context of the crisis in Yugoslavia. Again, as I pointed out, it was the Europeans that were most fearful of the spread of the violence in Yugoslavia in terms of refugees and so on and so forth. But the United States really felt particularly threatened by what was going on in that region is very much an open question. In that regard, the Europeans had every interest in trying to make common cause, in part in order to allow them to develop their own capacities to deal with these kinds of situations. And one of the first things that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union in that context was the announcement that the Europeans were developing their own rapid reaction force and had created a force of 60,000 soldiers for that purpose. We're developing a common security and defense policy. And we're on the way to trying to develop a common foreign policy among the various countries of the European Union. The reason for that was essentially to allow them to develop the kind of capacities that would, to a greater extent, allow them to be responsible for their own security and therefore less dependent on the United States. But they were also very well aware that they did not yet have that capacity. And indeed, even to this day, while European military capacities have increased somewhat, Europe is a long ways from being able to be the author of its own security. It's still very much reliant on the United States for that kind of protection. For that reason, the way that your textbooks puts it, the Europeans are in a situation that he calls sort of leash slipping, but not leash cutting. They're not cutting their relationship with the United States, but simply drawing away from the United States to a greater extent, while at the same time trying to maintain a relatively close and positive relationship with them. Now, one reason for that is that the kinds of threat perceptions of the United States have changed in the context of the post-Cold War era, as have those of Europe. In this regard, the United States has increasingly focused its threat perceptions on threats emanating from the Middle East in the form of terrorism, and to concerns about China. And it's in particular in regard to the latter that the perceptions of the United States and Europe depart rather drastically. The United States is increasingly, since at least the arrival of the Obama administration in the White House, seen China as a fundamental problem. And consequently, Obama promised to pivot to Asia in American concerns with regard to security. And that in turn meant that much of the military resources available to the United States would be shifted out of their traditional focus on Europe and the Middle East and increasingly concentrated in the perceived threat to American dominance emanating from China. Do Europeans see China as a fundamental threat? Not really. For the Europeans, China is a pretty distant country. And for the most part, an enormous opportunity, especially for countries like Germany. Again, because of the complementarity of their economies. Germany is above all else a major exporter of capital goods, of high-tech capital goods. And this is precisely the kinds of technologies that the Chinese economy is very, very hungry for. Furthermore, Germany is certainly interested in maintaining the standard of living of its citizens, and in that sense is not particularly interested in producing cheap consumer goods within their own borders, but very much takes advantage of the supply offered by China to keep costs of living in Germany relatively low. What that signifies is the beginnings of a rift between the United States and Europe that is starting to play out in a number of different contexts. And one of the most important arenas that demonstrates this different perception of threats is the growing dispute between Europe and the United States over how to deal with Iran. The United States, for reasons that I would suggest are largely irrational, and have everything to do with the long and ugly history of Iranian and American relations, and little to do with geostrategic realities, by which Iran is in no ways a threat to the homeland of the United States, although it may be a threat to some of its partners in the Middle East. The United States seems pretty focused on the threat, the military threat of Iran. The Europeans, for the most part, have not taken the threat of Iran seriously in the same sense, but instead see Iran as a relatively passive player in the international realm. Indeed, Iran has not invaded its neighbors in over 300 years, but as an opportunity, again, to expand their exports. And the complementarity of Iranian and European economies is again evident in this regard. Iran is above all else an exporter of hydrocarbons, for which the Europeans have a considerable amount of demand, and is a modernizing third world state. In other words, is very hungry for Western technologies with which to expand its manufacturing industries, its medical system, its state enterprises, and so on and so forth. In that sense, it becomes a lucrative market for exports, especially again from Germany. It's of course in this particular context that from the perspective of Europe, we had a bull walking into the China shop in the form of Donald Trump coming into the White House, who roundly announced that he was going to focus with a single-minded focus on the threat emanating from China by starting a economic war with China. All of which might have made some sense. Certainly the United States had an enormous trade deficit with China, and certainly the Chinese economy is in many ways subsidizing certain aspects of their production that make their products more attractive on world markets, but that's all a relatively minor matter. And indeed, if Chinese cheating was such an important matter, or such an important factor in explaining the trade deficits with the United States, that should certainly have been a problem that could have been solved through the World Trade Organization. And it would have been relatively easy, if that was the main problem, to get the Europeans to go along with the United States in confronting China in the World Trade Organization and forcing them to back off of their currency manipulation and their various subsidy programs and so on. The problem is that most international economists came to the conclusion that while there might have been a little bit of currency manipulation about 10, 15 years ago on the part of the Chinese, that is no longer the case, and probably never has been a decisive factor. Instead of trying to get a international coalition to confront China in a way as to contain its economic growth, Donald Trump imposed various kinds of tariffs on most of his allies, and was rather hostile to Europe on a number of different fronts. First of all, by elevating Iran in terms of the threats faced by the international community to a high level, This was something that simply Europeans weren't willing to go along with. And in particular, since the Obama administration seemed to have settled the issue of Iran, and Europeans were quite happy to have that issue settled and to have the sanctions that restricted their trade with Iran withdrawn. To have them unilaterally reimposed by the United States created a deep rift. The Europeans immediately promised to set up various mechanisms by which those unilateral and illegal sanctions against Iran under international law could be bypassed, but has so far not been very successful in doing so. But nonetheless, it is considerably rankled in this regard. Secondly, Europeans, largely because of the nature of their populations, but perhaps also because of the nature of their governments, are much more convinced than their North American counterparts of the fundamental and existential threat posed by climate change. And again, in that context, the United States under the Trump administration proved itself outrightly hostile to any attempts to deal with that threat as perceived by most European governments. Lastly, the Europeans certainly still view nuclear weapons and the possession of nuclear weapons, predominantly by the United States and Russia, as a fundamental existential threat to their own security. And that has once again been made much, much more pronounced by the Trump administration. The Trump administration, in particular in this regard, announced its unilateral withdrawal from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement came into effect in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, a Republican administration that Donald Trump claims to be inspired by, basically for a fairly straightforward and for Europeans very important consideration. And that is that intermediate nuclear missiles, those that have a range of between 300 and 1,000 kilometers, were in the context of the Cold War, relevant in only one place in the world. Where would you station intermediate nuclear missiles if in the Cold War? Well, they obviously wouldn't be stationed in the United States because they can't make it across the Atlantic. So they have to be stationed within 1,000 kilometers of Russian territory, which meant Western Europe. And that meant that those missile installations in Western Europe were prominent targets for the Soviets if a war were ever to break out, and basically guaranteed that a nuclear confrontation would essentially destroy, wipe Western Europe off the map. And it's for that reason that Reagan, as well as Gorbachev, recognized that since a nuclear war was unsurvivable, that the better approach was to rely on strategic nuclear weapons and on mutually assured destruction in that context, and to eliminate those intermediate missiles. One other reason for that, of course, is that intermediate nuclear missiles take about 10 minutes to get from where they're fired to their target. Intercontinental ballistic missiles take about 45 minutes to reach their targets. And that means that when a missile firing is detected by one side, they have 45 minutes to determine whether this was a mistaken blip, whether they should return fire, whether it was a real attack or not. And in that context, often have the time to be able to contact the government of Russia to find out whether a missile was actually fired, and to avoid taking unnecessary counter steps. With intermediate missiles, you have 10 minutes. And usually it would take 5 minutes to just get a hold of the leader that has to make the decision whether to push the button or not. In other words, they would have to more or less instantly decide whether something was a real attack or simply a false alarm. And that, of course, makes an accidental outbreak of nuclear war ever more likely. Again, from that point of view, the withdrawal of the United States from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement was seen in Europe as an existential threat, because basically it would once again mean that a confrontation between Russia and the United States would to a large extent take place on European territory. For that reason, there is every reason to expect that the idea of walking this fine line of leash slipping, as it was described in your textbook, of not completely breaking the relations between the United States and Europe, is becoming ever more difficult, and Europe may well find itself at a point where it has decided that it's best to cut off its relationship with the United States and to counterbalance against it. Indeed, most of the European populations already view the United States as the most fundamental threat to world peace on the planet. Not Russia, not China, not Iran, not any other country than the United States. Why haven't they done so? The easiest answer is economics. Pulling out of the American system of economic institutions, and in particular the US dollar as a reserve currency in international trade, has proved to be enormously difficult, if not impossible. And it's the dominance of the United States in the economic realm that has allowed, or that has made it virtually impossible, for example, for the Europeans, despite their commitment to do so, to bypass American sanctions on Iran. Why? Because the German government and the French government and the British government may all be on side with the nuclear agreement with Iran and may want to bypass the sanctions. But the sanctions affect not those governments, but the companies that do business in Iran. And Donald Trump made it very clear that German companies, regardless of what their government thinks about all of this, should decide very carefully whether they want to do business with Iran or whether they want to do business with the United States. They can't do both. And if you're the head of Mercedes or BMW or VW or something along those lines, which country do you think is a more important market, Iran or the United States? Well, it's pretty straightforward. In just about every instance, these companies will go with their profit motives, and those still point in the direction of the United States. And consequently, will not allow the European countries to develop a seriously independent foreign policy. That is beginning to change rather slowly, however. One reason for that is because increasingly China is becoming a more important trading partner and a bigger market for European exports than the United States is. The United States, from that point of view, is pretty much tapped out. The most recent analyses of the American economy have found that 50% of American households would not be able to pay $400 if an emergency arose that required that, without having to go into further debt. In other words, they're already pretty much tapped out in terms of their credit card debt and mortgages and so on and so forth, which means that consumer market is no longer nearly as attractive as it was when the United States had this giant middle class of big consumers. China, by contrast, is emerging as an enormous consumer with an enormous middle class that is dwarfing that of the United States, and may very well in time change that economic calculus in such a way as to make it much easier for Europeans to break away from the dominance of the US. I gather from the restlessness of at least some that I'm approaching the end of my welcome. Sorry, I don't mean to single you out. We all have good reasons why we have to take off once in a while. But let me see if there's any quick questions or comments about anything that I've said so far, or any confusion that I've caused by what I've said. If not, then thanks for your attention, and we'll see you all next week for the examination of German foreign policy in our process of slowly getting caught up with the syllabus. We're almost there. Useful. I think that was 12,082, around 3,500, so it's roughly 12. Do me a favor, send me an email reminding me of your test so that I don't forget. Thank you.